All right, welcome back, psychology. We are going to continue our study of the biological basis of behavior, and we will learn about, in this video, more structures of the brain. So again, there's a ton of parts to the brain, but they are all equally as important in terms of how they impact our behavior. So let's get going. So the structures of the brain, in the last video we learned about the hindbrain, sometimes called the old brain or the primitive brain, and that was that structure just above the spinal cord. And now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the brain, and the first place we're going to stop is what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system, like I was saying, is basically it's like the border between the old brain, okay, the brain stem, and the newer brain, the newer parts. And it doesn't mean that our brain didn't have these parts before, it just means that we didn't know about them before. And so it's in terms of the discovery of these parts. And the limbic system consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And for the most part, the limbic system is responsible for our behavioral and our emotional responses. When we talked about adolescence in the development unit, the limbic system is the one part, the one response, the one area of your brain that is in adolescence, in the adolescent stage, it is fully developed. And so again, those emotional responses are quick and easy when you're an adolescent. So an easy way to remember what the limbic system is responsible for, if you remember that the letter L for limbic system, this could very well be backwards as it's filming me, but the letter L for limbic system, L is also for love. And that's what happens in the limbic system, your emotional responses. So we've talked about the thalamus already when we talked about the brain stem, but just to review, because this is kind of the gateway into the limbic system, this is the area where all of that sensory information passes through. It's that relay station. It receives all of the information from the senses and then routes it, sends it, thanks to our traffic cops, Hal and Amos, thalamus, sends it to the different parts of the brain, which we're going to learn about in this video as well. So the first part of the limbic system, a new term, is the hypothalamus. Okay, so we've got the thalamus, they're kind of the traffic cops, the relay station. Now we need to understand what the hypothalamus does. And in regards to behavior and emotion, this makes total sense. The hypothalamus regulates what I like to call your 5 F's. Your response to food or hunger, fun, fever, temperature, fight or flight, that's your stress response, and the word fornication. Fornication is a really, really long name. It starts with an F, so does something else. But you can also just say sex. Okay. So the 5 F's, hypothalamus, food, fun, fever, fight and flight, and fornication. So this is like our reward center. It also oversees the endocrine system, that fight or flight response. There's going to obviously be a connection with our sympathetic nervous system. I mean, there is so much that happens in the hypothalamus. And to be honest, if you ever come across a question on an exam and the hypothalamus is one of the choices and you have no idea what the answer is, oh my goodness, look at all of the things that the hypothalamus is responsible for. That would probably be a really good guess. It's responsible for our motivational behavior. And again, our hunger, our desire to have fun, which is excitement, regulating temperature, our stress response, and our sexual desire. So a way to remember this, we've got to bring back our friends Hal and Al, because we are talking about the thalamus here. Thalamus, Hal, and Al are going to a hyped up party, right? Food, fun, fever, fight, flight, fornication. Woo! Don't you want an invitation? Okay. Really, Ms. Puente. So the next part of the limbic system is the hippocampus. Ooh, you know the hippocampus. You know about it because it's important in forming new long-term memories, okay? The hippocampus, do you remember the day the hippocampus came on campus? All right, so again, the hippo, do you remember? The hippocampus has to do with forming long-term memories. The hippocampus is part of the limbic system. The next part of the limbic system is called the amygdala. The amygdala. And the amygdala is primarily involved in processing emotion and survival responses. So we know the limbic system in general is responsible for emotional responses, but the amygdala especially has influence over things like aggression, anger, and fear. So those potentially threatening situations where you are afraid. It's kind of the coordinator of the fight or flight response, okay, the amygdala, aggression, anger, and fear. And I don't know if this is an example that would help you, and you might be able to come up with something on your own that might be better, but I have a picture of a jet fighter here. And if you know anything about jet fighters, sometimes they are called MiGs, and a MiG is going to go after, it's a fighter plane, it's going after someone, okay? It's an aggressive, angry airplane. All right, so the amygdala, aggression, anger, and fear. This is a good part of the brain as we get into Halloween season. The amygdala is working hard. All right, so the next thing we need to know about the brain is that there are two hemispheres in the brain, the right and the left side. So as we learn about the hemispheres, what you need to understand is that the left controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, but they work together. They're not just two independent pieces of the brain doing their own thing. Okay, it doesn't work that way. What happens is we have this bundle of nerves that connect the right and left hemisphere. And those bundles of nerves, it's what we call the corpus callosum, And it's kind of like a superhighway of nerves. And these messages move in between the hemisphere, sending messages from one side of the brain to the other, the corpus callosum. So an easy way or a possible way to remember the corpus callosum, the end of the word callosum is sum, S-U-M, and a sum is an addition problem. So the left brain plus the right brain, because you put them together, and the corpus callosum adds the two brains together. So when we are talking about the hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left brain, what we need to understand is the term lateralization. And lateralization is the evidence that exists that shows that each of our hemispheres of the brain has its own distinct functions. It's called lateralization. So let's go through what some of those responsibilities are and how our brain operates and how it works together thanks to that network of nerves in the corpus callosum. So we have a nice little brain here, okay? And let's start with the very back of the brain. And the very back of the brain is where we process vision messages. So in the back of the brain, the area responsible for vision, in the left hemisphere, this is where words and letters are going to be produced, okay? In the left hemisphere, language, words and letters. On the right hemisphere, your vision is going to be processing things like patterns and faces, emotional expression. You're going to be able to read people, okay? So your vision is taking in these things, but because of the way your right and left hemisphere processes information, the lateralization is saying that your brain in different parts, right and left hemisphere, they have different responsibilities and they'll process that information differently. Your temporal lobes, we'll get to the different lobes of the brain, but the hearing responsibility for the left and the right hemisphere. In the left hemisphere, again, language related, but those are the sounds of language, okay? And you have the ability to understand the sounds of the letters, language sounds. On the right hemisphere, these are going to be things that you hear that are not words, that are not language. So noises, music, okay, non-language sounds are going to be processed through the right hemisphere. Memory, okay, the hippocampus, they're in the limbic system. Verbal memory, so oftentimes semantic memory, okay, things that you hear, those are going to be processed in the left hemisphere. Nonverbal memory, maybe things that you read, experience that are written, okay, that is going to be processed in the right hemisphere. So some more language, speech, grammar rules, reading, writing, arithmetic, okay, left hemisphere. But your right hemisphere is going to understand the tone and be able to make a judgment about the way something was said and understand the emotional tone of speech. Spatial ability is going to also happen in the right hemisphere. And notice that ability doesn't exist in the left hemisphere. So things like your sense of direction, when you're out and about and trying to figure out where to go without your phone and GPS, it's your right hemisphere that will allow you the wherewithal to understand where you're going, how far it is, to understand angles and things like that. So there is a very distinct difference between the processes and responsibilities of the left hemisphere compared to the right hemisphere. So when we look at the brain as a whole, okay, we need to understand that when we think of a picture of the brain, this is kind of what we envision. But what we're looking at here is really the outer layer of the brain. And this is basically tissue, and it's all folded within itself. And if you took a tissue or a Kleenex and you crumpled it all up, it's really, the brain could be stretched out and flattened, but we've got to squish it all together and compact it into one nice little package here. So what we call this is the cerebral cortex, and it's the outer layer of the brain. It's tissue folded on itself, and those folding and wrinkles allow for more surface area of cortex to fit into the skull. Okay, bigger brains, is going to be able to hold more information. And so the cerebral cortex receives and processes sensory information, and it directs movement. And the cerebral cortex also is responsible for higher order thinking skills, planning, judgment, all right? The cerebral cortex is that covering. And so here we go, another lame way to remember a part of the brain. In Texas, they wear big cowboy hats, right? In Texas, they wear cowboy hats. So if you can remember the cerebral cortex, T-E-X, like the state of Texas. The cerebral cortex is like a big hat protecting all the parts that are inside. The cerebral cortex. Here are some examples, just a kind of cool picture here of all of the cerebral cortexes of different species and animals. And you can see here the bottom getting a little progressively more mature, so to speak, in terms of evolution and what brains can do in different species. And this is the human brain. You can compare it to, I don't know, a cat brain. My dear Oreo. Cat brain compared to human brain looks a little bit different. So now that we know that the cerebral cortex is that outer covering, like the hat, cowboy hats from Texas, the cerebral cortex covering the brain, we need to understand and be able to label and identify the different parts of the cerebral cortex, the different areas. And we call those areas lobes. And each of the lobes of the brain has a specific function. Okay, and they're divided up just like a map is. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of the different lobes of the brain. So the first lobe of the brain is what we call the frontal lobe. And for you as a teenager, this is the part of the brain that's not done growing yet. You still have a good 8 to 10 years till the frontal lobe is fully developed. The frontal lobe is responsible for higher mental functionings, interpreting and controlling behaviors. It's your decision-making center. Oh, I should have done that. Oh, I could have had a V8, if you know the commercial. This is one of the most famous case studies in regards to neuroscience. The gentleman's name is Phineas Gage, and he really was kind of a well-liked, respected guy, worked on the railroad, and he was involved in an accident with dynamite, and this explosion sent a steel rod that went through his skull, under his cheek, and went out his forehead. And you can see the trajectory of where that rod went. It permanently damaged his frontal lobe. Miraculously, he survived with no speech, motor memory impairment, nothing happened. But again, there was severe damage to the frontal lobe, and he was a forever changed individual. And we'll look a little bit more at Phineas Gage in class together. Okay, frontal lobe, the next lobe area of the brain is what we call the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe contains the center for processing sensory signals like touch. And if I pat something, I am touching it. And if I pat the top of my head, that's really where the parietal lobe is. And so if you pat something, you're going to feel the sense of touch, pressure, even temperature and pain. So the parietal lobe contains the center for processing touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. One thing that you notice there, you've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, but in between there, it looks almost like a headband there, like a little headband structure of the lobe. What that is called, that is what we call the somatosensory cortex, the somatosensory cortex. And again, it's part of this whole system involved with touch sensations and all of the body parts. All right, next are the occipital lobes. The occipital lobes, and those are located in the very back of your brain. And the occipital lobe contain the visual centers for the brain. The important thing to remember about the occipital lobes. If you look at this diagram here, if you see something out of your right field of vision, do you see how your eyes take in that information? And it's represented here with the green. It comes in through your right eye, but your left occipital lobe is going to process that visual. And your left visual field is going to take in that image, and that will be processed in the right occipital lobe. So again, your occipital lobe is in the back of your head, and there is a phrase sometimes people will say that your mom has eyes in the back of your head. Your teachers have eyes in the back of your head. Why? Because that's where your occipital lobe is located. So frontal lobe, parietal lobe at the top of your head, occipital lobe, you've got eyes in the back of your head. The last lobe we're going to talk about is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is responsible for the sense of hearing and speech. It's responsible for hearing and speech. And the temporal lobes are located right above your ears. And if you think about temporal lobes responsible for hearing, and you think about the word tempo, and tempo has a lot to do with music, and music is something that you can hear. The Wernicke's area, responsible for language comprehension. The Wernicke's area is located in the temporal lobe. Okay, again, temporal lobe, tempo, music, parietal lobe, touch, frontal lobe, decisions, occipital lobe, eyes in the back of your head, vision. There we go. That's it. So in our next video, we're going to look a little more specifically at the right and left brain, and we're going to dive into an interesting concept about split brain procedures.